Want your stenciled backgrounds to stand out? Watch how these simple changes make a big difference. We've all seen the latest craze of layering stencils, and whether or not you've taken the plunge, I think we all have to admit they sure create beautiful cards. But what happens if you don't own layering stencils? Well, what you're simply going to do is just go through your stencil stash, and you're going to find a stencil that has a lot of open space and one with more detail. This month in the Justine Hovey VIP community, I'm going to be going through how to do this in precise detail and which stencils will generally always look good together. But for now, let's continue with this video. So I'm going to grab a few stencils that I'm going to create with for today, and let's get started on the cards. So for this one particular here, I've grabbed this splotch here. It's an old stencil from Tim Holtz, and this is old footage, actually, to be honest. But I wanted to show this technique to show that it does work. And I love this card, so I thought, why not revisit it? All right, so I'm going and I'm placing this onto my card, and I'm just going to ink blend on top of it normally. So you can use any ink for this, it really doesn't matter. So I'm going in with some regular distress ink, mustard seed, just a yellow color, and I'm using a dauber here or a blending tool to fill that in. Now this is what I mean by having an area with a lot of open space. So you don't have any really details in it, it just is laying down a splotch of ink. Next up, you're going to grab something that's more detailed and you can go over top. Whether you choose to go over top in a different color or the same color is up to you. So now you can see here that I have this really pretty pattern that I have now layered into my stencil, and now I can combine different stencils to make it as unique as I like. The thing is, you do have to clean your stencil in between when you're doing this if you're going to be laying it down multiple times like I am, and just ensure it's completely dry so that you don't get any ink smudges from the water. So next up, I'm going in with each of the colors, and I'm just going in a rainbow order, and you can see here how you can build up a really great pattern. To make the pattern even more fun, you can keep one stencil like I did, that ink splotch, and I actually switched out the detailed stencil each time to add different textures to the card. I think this is a really fun way to stretch your stencils. So I use things like dots, a chevron background, florals, whatever the case is or whatever you like. Now here is the big reveal. Now to finalize this card, it really doesn't need anything else, and that's what I love about this. You chose a technique, you did the technique, add a sentiment, and you're done. This video is so old, look, I'm not even using a Misty, I'm using the old stamp tool from Fiskars. Isn't it fun to revisit the old tools that we used to use? I like to call this the hover and pray tool, because if you stamped wrong the first time, then you kind of had to hover over top and pray you stamped in the wrong spot, or in the right spot again, because 90% of the time it was off just ever so slightly and you ruined your whole card. For those of you with layering stencils, I'm not going to leave you out. Why not try adding something a little different to the first layer? So instead of going in with your standard layering stencils and then going from 1, 2, 3, 4, why not add a stencil in between? So for this one, on top of the first layer of the floral, I went in and added this Moroccan tile, I think it's called stencil, or Moroccan something. And I really love this pattern. Now, whether or not this is going to look good with all the layers, I'm going to find out more towards the end of the card. There's not really an exact science like I go through in the VIP program about which stencils pair together with single stencils that work well for the layered stencils. It's more or less just some experimentation. So now you have this, and now you can layer on the other layers as much as you want, or of course you can just leave it as is. Now comes the big reveal. 1, 2, 3. Now you have this sort of unique pattern inside of your flower on top of all of the layers. I think it looks pretty cool and gives your stencils a little bit more life. And at this point in time, your card doesn't need really anything else. I paired it with a simple thanks script sentiment, a couple of little embellishment confetti pearl jewel things, and it's all done. What do you think? Is this a look you like or something you're going to skip? This is something quite new to me. Usually I like control over my designs and knowing how they're going to turn out, but let's try to live on the edge a little. After all, trying things without knowing how they will turn out will help us grow as crafters. Let's grab that floral stencil from our first card that still has ink all over it. Let's not be wasteful and see if we can turn this into another card. What's the worst that can happen? I'm going to lightly spritz water over the stencil and press my stencil like a stamp onto my cardstock. Actually, I think it would be easier to place the cardstock on top of the stencil. I'm going to gently lift the paper to see how this turns out. So this is how it turned out after it dried. There's not a very crisp image, but it's subtle and a beautiful background, kind of like a watercolor spritz. So I went ahead and added a couple of little embellishments here. These are just simple stamps that are layered, colored with layering stencils, and I really wanted an opportunity to use them. So I thought, why not add them to this card? It makes it a beautiful design, and all it really needs at the end of the day is a sentiment. Next up, we have partial stenciling, which is something you might already be familiar with, but another great way to stretch your stencils. So what I'm doing is just putting a little bit of repositionable tape onto my card, and I'm marking off a diagonal. You could also do a straight from left to right if you prefer. I'm going to be using a layering stencil here, but it really doesn't matter which type of stencil you use, whether it's layering or whether it's a single stencil. What you will notice is with my blending brush here, I am going in from the right side heavier than the left. This gives me a little more details and can also really change your stenciling game by adding shading to your stencils. I would recommend, however, using a smaller brush than this one, but this is my pink brush and I don't have a million brushes on hand, so I am just lightly and carefully going through, making sure the right side is darker than the other side. So let's see what that looks like. Again, another game changer for stencils, doing detailed blending, what they call it over stop of stencils, rather than a single layer of color with the same pressure. All right, then all you need to do is finish all your layers, whether it's 1 or 6 layers with your ink, and then you're gonna remove your stencil and then remove the masking when you're finished all of the stenciling. And this is another really great technique that is very inexpensive. I think having something like this mint tape or repositionable tape is the best thing you can have in your craft stash if you're on a budget or if you just like to have fun with techniques. My favorite way to finish off these types of cards is, again, something simple. I grab a very thin sentiment and I just place it along the diagonal. If you want to spice things up, put 2. So I stamped these 2 here on the angles, and then it says, "You are flippin' amazeballs. Your awesomeness is boundless." I love these. They're such unique sentiments. I'm always on the market for unique sentiments. Why not trying adding something a little different to the first layer? You could use a variety of things in your stash, from white embossing paste to embossing ink and powder to any type of texture paste you may have in your craft stash. Give them all a try like I did. To experiment quickly, I did the following. I bulk created the first layers of each card. I did this as many times as I had paste to try out. Then came the second layer, and I repeated each layer until I got to the last layer. I applied each type of paste to the final layer, being careful to clean it between each paste. I added a variety of things to the last layer, being sure to clean my stencil very well in between. Now, I added things like transfer gel. This would allow me to get a foiled look on my last layer. I added white embossing paste. I added things like embossing ink for embossing powder. So let's go through each layer and see what it looks like when it's all done. So if you are creating an experiment book or an experiment page or things for your technique resource binder and you are doing this, I recommend labeling them before putting the wet layer. I went in very carefully and did this afterwards in between while everything was drying. Some of these things I still need to add to, and some of them I don't. Like this transfer gel, for example, I obviously need to go in with the foil once it's all settled and sticky. And the other things, the heat embossing, obviously I had to set with my heat tool, and the embossing paste and the translucent paste, obviously that just needed to dry on its own. All right, here's a close-up of the Distress Texture Paste Translucent. Gives sort of a neon fluorescent look, not a fan. Next up we have the Transfer Duos with some silver foil. I really like this look, it's really fun. Then we have Distress Embossing Glaze. So this is in the bottom left corner there. All that is translucent embossing powder from Tim Holtz. Next we have Altenew embossing paste. This is a white paste, and because I let the layer dry in between, it stayed pretty stark white. I like this look a lot. And lastly, we have regular Wow Sparkly embossing powder in the top right corner. Now that you see how these stenciling techniques can transform your backgrounds, you may be wondering how you can take it a little further. What if I told you there's an ink that can give you endless possibilities with stencils, creating rich blends, layering effects, and even textures? In my next video, I'll show you 5 amazing ways to use distress oxides with stencils. Whether you're new to the inks or a seasoned crafter, you won't want to miss how they can level up your designs. Click here to watch 5 ways to use distress oxides with stencils now, And let's take your stenciling skills to the next level. I'll see you over there.